Once upon a time, there were two liberal denominations. Both had grown up in the soil of New England during the 19th century. Both believed in freedom of thought and conscience. Both believed that all humans have value and that there ought to be a world community living in peace. Both were comprised of independent congregations who democratically elected their leaders. There were no bishops, archbishops, or popes. Of course, this is the story of the Universalist Church of America and the American Unitarian Association, which used to be separate organizations. It was only natural for these two free-thinking churches to cooperate with each other. In the decades after World War II, they proposed joining together as a single force. But before they could, they had to work out what they had in common, and a lot of give and take was required. The Universalists explicitly followed the teachings of Jesus, while the Unitarians tended to be more humanist. But that was okay because both accepted a wide range of theologies from atheist to Christian, and neither held their members to a written creed. Creeds and doctrines exclude and divide, and both these churches wanted to unite people. Unity was in both of their names. If they were to join together, what was the purpose of this Unitarian Universalist Association? Under what principles would it operate, and to what ends? They decided to come up with a document that they could both agree to, and after some very difficult debates, in 1961 they agreed on 6 principles to unite behind, and the UUA was born. Now, those original 6 principles from 1961 were a product of their time and their place and weren't very inspiring. During the 1970s, the UU Women's Federation campaigned to expunge not only sexist language from those principles in our hymnal, but the emphasis on individualism that was the legacy of a previously male-dominated movement. After 4 years of typically liberal debates about words, omissions, additions, and drafts, a new statement of 6 principles and purposes was submitted to General Assembly in 1984. And the draft proposal was good, but it was missing something. Now, the first 6 principles are basically only about human beings and how we ought to relate to each other. There's not much transcendence or wonder at the universe or recognition that life forms exist outside of our little human bubble. Meanwhile, UUs had become increasingly aware that pollution, extinctions, and climate change were the consequences of our extractive, dominionist view of the world. So the Assembly proposed adding a 7th principle to the draft. And the Reverend Paul LaRue came to the microphone and proposed that we should affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are each a part. James Ishmael Ford was at that GA, and he wrote, "The Assembly then voted to accept the proposed change, and with that decision, our little band found itself marked with an astonishing charism, a particular channel of divine blessing aimed at healing this poor, broken world. I suggest that in that hour, our future was articulated with as much authority as if it were from the tongue of an ancient prophet. With that call, a new universalism has been proclaimed." End quote. A new universalism, indeed. The original Universalist Church was based on the theology of universal salvation, the idea that God doesn't separate souls into the saved and the damned. The new universalism of the 7th principle affirms that every human being is connected and woven together in existence with everything else, just as Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and Darwin had proposed. This new universalism isn't concerned with just the fate of souls. It seeks to save the planet and more. This interdependent web of which we are a small part truly extends out into the universe. As Carl Sagan said, the nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interior of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff. The seventh principle injected awe, wonder, and transcendence into what otherwise would be a list of nice, inspiring, logical ideals. This is no postscript principle. It's a theological revolution that reunites Unitarian Universalists with the earth-centered religions that were repressed by patriarchal religions for thousands of years. In the very first book of the Bible, God tells humanity to fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. That attitude is very different from the earth-centered traditions that venerated the planet and saw the fish and the birds and the beasts as relatives, not things solely to be used and harvested for humankind. In the seventh principle, that dominion, that unquestioned rule over the earth is overturned. We're not the boss of everything. We're a part of everything. Anything we do to the web affects us as well. It's a grand illusion to think otherwise. Now, here in rural New England, we might think that we're pretty isolated from the world. As I was driving the other morning, I looked east towards the sun and I was struck by the red color, unusual haze. And I realized that that's because of the smoke being carried high in the atmosphere from the millions of acres of forest that are burning on the West Coast, thousands of miles from us. Meanwhile, over the radio came a report of thousands of dead migratory birds in New Mexico, possibly from that smoke or the extreme heat wave of the preceding weeks. We have hummingbird feeders at our home here in Conway, and all the hummingbirds have headed to Mexico for the winter a few weeks ago. So did the monarch butterflies that grew from the milkweed. I wonder if they got past the hurricanes that were in the Gulf or whether they were blown off course. Now, part of our grand illusion of our separateness from the web is that we can wall ourselves off somehow. Now, I'd never heard of Wuhan, China before this year, and there certainly isn't much traffic between Wuhan and Franklin County. But online, you can see a map that traces how the SARS-CoV-2 virus hitched a ride on human beings in all directions to other parts of China, to Korea and Japan, then Europe, then Washington State and New York, and eventually right here. It might have broken out first in the so-called blue states, but over the summer, the red states had their turn. Whether we like it or not, we're all part of the web. Our society believes in individualism. Our first UU principle says that we affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. But there are limits to that focus on the I instead of the we. Individualism says, I don't have to wear a mask in public. I can go to a big party in a crowded room and it's nobody's business but mine. That's not true in a pandemic. The virus that somebody carries to the party could go to you, then to members of your family, and then to me, because we're interdependent. Now, one of the reasons that conservatives are so opposed to taking action on climate change to the extent of denying that it even exists is that there's no effective solution that isn't global. And they see any kind of global action as infringing on their individual rights, their sovereign rights. This lack of awareness of our interconnectedness is what kept the U.S. out of the League of Nations between the wars and has undermined the United Nations for several decades. A year ago this week, President Trump addressed the UN General Assembly and said, "The future does not belong to the globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens." How ironic that a year later, 200,000 Americans have died because of this grand illusion that you could protect your citizens by withdrawing from international health organizations, by pulling your scientists and monitors out of epidemic areas, by putting a travel ban on China, but not Americans coming from Italy and Spain at the same time. The virus doesn't care about the nationality of the lungs it's traveling in. Viruses are globalists. So are the oceans and the ice sheets and the atmosphere. Patriotism and sovereignty don't separate us from the web of all existence. And if we don't respect that, no amount of marketing or propaganda or denial will be able to save us. That is the prophetic call of the seventh principle. History is demonstrating its truth right in front of our eyes. We can only pray that the eyes of the powerful are opened to this truth before it's too late.